everyone, welcome to the community classroom. This is Dr. Tracey McCarthy, psychologist, attorney, and educator, and we are turning our attention to finding your place on the tree in relation to surnames. And so we're going to look at tracing your history through surnames. We're going to look at Irish and Scottish surnames in terms of mainland America and the Caribbean. We're also going to turn our attention to the issue of slave ships and what slave ships some of your ancestors may have come on and some of the routes that they may have taken that many people may not have considered up to this point. We're also going to look at a touchy issue of whether your ancestors may have played some role in their enslavement. And attendant to that, we're going to look at the legal issue of high treason and prisoners of war. And we're going to end up with a little bit of food for thought regarding the R1b haplogroup. Now, before we get started, I want to point out something. One of the reasons why it has been difficult for many people to trace their heritage, and we've talked about this before, it has to do with distorted views about race and skin color. And people have basically turned skin color into a religion. And it doesn't matter whether we're talking about people who are identifying themselves as white or people who are identifying themselves as black or identifying themselves as melanated or highly melanated. What's been happening is people have been idolizing skin color. And when this happens, it makes it very difficult for people to see past skin color, to see some facts that might be different than what they might be looking for. And so what happens is that people are using skin color to create history and recreate history. This happens in terms of the slave trade. And so people are making all sorts of assumptions about everyone in Africa or who has ever been in Africa has been black, and every person in Europe has been white, and therefore all of the slaves must have been black and all of the enslavers must have been white. And this creates all sorts of confusion when people then bring up issues about, well, what about the Irish slave trade? What about the white slaves? What about the Barbary Coast slave trade? And people are making all sorts of assumptions even then. So people will assume that all of the Irish were white, so they'll call it the Irish white slave trade. And again, this comes from making all sorts of assumptions about skin color and idolizing skin color. People have taken this idolizing dynamic so far that there is basically religion based upon skin color. So you'll have people on YouTube even delivering their sermons, their YouTube sermons, where they are directing sermons to people based upon their skin color and condemning people based upon their skin color or elevating people based upon their skin color. And so it makes it very difficult to accurately trace history and be objective about it when people are entertaining all of these preconceived notions about who people are now and who people have been historically. And so we're going to try to get past some of that. So the request is that you just keep your mind open as we explore this issue and touch on some things that you might not have considered before. And as promised, we are going to look at some of the legal issues that have had a great impact on history. And so there are some things that people might not have considered in terms of understanding the transatlantic slave trade. And hopefully these things will give you some insight and open up your mind and allow you to consider a number of other possibilities when you consider some of the legal issues that might have been behind the enslavement of some of your ancestors. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to address is the issue of surnames. And so one of the questions I would like for you to entertain is, why did Africans and Indians in the Americas have so many Scottish and Irish names in the 1700s? And if you recall the previous video when we talked about the free African Americans of North Carolina and Virginia, one of the things we did was we looked at, you could see the names. And if you make note of the names of these African Americans, Black Americans, Brown Americans, Indians. If you make note of the names, you might make note of the fact that many of them are Irish and Scottish names. Now, many people will offer that enslaved people, once they became free, they took on the names, or they continued to use the name of the former enslaver. But that would suggest that a large number of impoverished Irish people were major enslavers. And so what I want you to do is consider the possibility that these were simply your ancestors' surnames. Now, that's not to suggest that that is the case in all instances, but what I want you to do is just consider the possibility that this is their birth surname. For many of them, this may have been simply their birth surname. So what does this mean? It means thinking of your ancestors as coming to the Americas with last names such as Bennett and Cook and Armstrong and Archer and James and Jeffries and Smith and Snelling and Taylor and Thomas. Just considering the possibility that the Harrises and the Harrisons and the Cousins and the Cousins, the Copelands, the Coopers, the Connors, the Combs, the Colemans, that they came here, many of them, with those names. Now, you can ask the same question about West Indian names. Many West Indian people have Scottish and Irish surnames, and many assume that these Irish and Scottish surnames came from the surnames of the enslavers. Again, the request is that you consider the possibility that individuals arrived in the West Indies with these surnames. Now, of course, this takes a huge leap of faith for many people, but when you consider the fact that the majority of West Indians are brown, many people have a very difficult time making this leap with assuming that they came to the West Indies with these surnames. That is because there is an assumption that everyone who is brown in the West Indies arrived on a slave ship from Africa, and therefore they had no surname, and they had to take on the surname of the master, the enslaver. But for this activity, if you can, just consider the possibility that they arrived in the Americas with these surnames. And so when you see surnames such as Gordon or Graham or Reed, Richardson, when you see those surnames, just consider the possibility, just like with mainland America, that these surnames came with them. A long time coming, but I know. Hallelujah. Now, there are many debates that are going on regarding the history of brown individuals in the Americas. There are debates about whether people were already in the Americas and enslaved on their land, or whether people were brought from Africa and enslaved in Africa and then in the Americas. And so there are lots of debates, but for this discussion, we want to expand our thinking about perhaps another option. Perhaps some people came through another route. And so entertaining this possibility is going to require suspending many of your thoughts about race and skin color and the traditional narrative about who was enslaved, where they were enslaved, and how they may have made their way to the Americas, and what the relationship might have been between those individuals and the continent of Africa. A change gonna come. Oh, yes, it will. Now, the question for you to entertain is, did your ancestors arrive in the Americas from Europe via slave ships? Not just any slave ships, but rebel slave ships. And what you see is a showing of many of the names of the slave ships that transported people from Europe through a triangular trade into the Americas. And so they left England, Bristol, London, and made their way many times to Africa, and then made their way to the Americas. And the names for some of these slave ships were the Black Prince, Friendship, Scipio, African Galley, Elizabeth, Two Brothers. And not only were these slave ships, these were prison ships for individuals who were convicted rebels in Europe. And as you can see, these slave ships arrived anywhere from Virginia to Antigua to Jamaica. And these individuals were enslaved from the 1600s through the 1700s and on to the end of the 1700s. Now, of course, many people, I can imagine, are saying, no, that did not happen. That's not possible. Those aren't the same people. The Africans came one way, the Europeans came another way. But you are encouraged to do your own research and see if you come to any similar conclusions. Now, one of the things you see on the screen is the Africa Galley was one of the 10 ships used to transport to the Americas 639 rebel prisoners from 1,301 Jacobite rebels. And these individuals were kept in prison. And so there were different times that people were being transported, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. As you can see, between 1600 and 1700, a number of individuals were convicted of high treason. And those individuals were either executed, which is often a penalty for high treason, but for many of them, their lives were spared, and they were incarcerated, and they were placed on ships to be deported. And so they were placed on prison ships. They were placed on slave ships, basically, and they were enslaved and sent to the plantations in the Americas. And what you have here is a list of the convicted rebels and the order that they were to be placed on ships to be transported to Barbados. And Barbados, by the way, was basically created and sustained as a penal colony. And so the individuals were transported to Barbados or other plantations, and then also plantations in America, the mainland America. And as you can imagine, many people did not make it, and they were buried at sea. And so some of the mortality that you hear about related to the slave trade, it's related to these individuals. And to the right, you can see that one situation was related to King Charles' son and those who aided and abetted his actions against the monarchy. And this particular rebellion is slightly different in terms of the opponents, because in this instance, this was a succession battle also, but it was a battle for the crown, and it was related to family members. And so what we're going to do is we're going to look at a list of some of the individuals who were convicted and who were enslaved. You can see who the quote unquote masters were and who the enslaved individuals were. And if you're looking for the slave ships, you can pretty much find the slave ships for these convicted rebels in the listings, the names of the slave ships for the transatlantic slave trade. So you can look at the voyages and you can see the same names for these slave ships, such as the Jamaican Merchant. And so here you can see a list of the rebels. And many people might say that, you know, this was a blessing that they were enslaved instead of executed. It depends on your perspective, of course. And so you can see the list of the masters, the people that they were enslaved to, and you can see the names of the rebels. And so you can see some of the names. You have Richard Simmons, you have John Baker, another John Baker, Edward Kent. You can see William Pitts, Jonas Brown, John Timothy, John Cross, Luke Porter. So you can see a variety of names here, a variety of men who participated in one rebellion or another, and this was their penalty. And now part of the reason why people have not been putting the pieces together is because there has always been this assumption that everyone who was coming on those slave ships, they were all African and they were all quote unquote black. And then there was a belief that everyone who was enslaved in Ireland, everyone who was enslaved from Scotland, everyone who participated in these rebellions, that they were all white. And there was also this narrative that, you know, the people were given the title of convict. And so many people didn't stop to think, what were they convicted of? And so people sort of get the image in their heads that, you know, they were engaged in thievery and they were engaged, you know, they were robbing people and, you know, pillaging and doing all of those sorts of things. And so many people did not take into consideration that the crime was a political crime. And for many of them, that's exactly what it was. And so even thinking about it that way gives another vantage point in terms of understanding who actually was enslaved and who actually made their way to the Americas. The UK is now finally starting to admit in their national archives that people, brown people, were actually in the United Kingdom prior to now. And so you can see records that they are starting to release in their archives, and so that's very helpful. They're releasing more and more. They started off, you know, making the admission a few years ago that there were brown people there, and so now they've expanded it to include more data, more resources, and more admissions. And so they've also incorporated Indians and Indians from India, and also other Asian groups in their sharing. Now, when you are doing your searches, you are going to have to be diligent. So you might want to request some sort of assistance or get someone to help you, hire someone, because there's going to be the requirement of some deep digging for a number of people. And so you can see on the UK archive website, you can see some information about the treason conviction records. But one of the things that they make clear is that they did not necessarily maintain as many records as they needed to maintain or should have maintained. And so in many instances, a lot of these people were almost written out of history. And so you will need to actually, you know, go and look at the records and dig through the records, and remember to keep in mind that the spellings of names may be a little different than what you might be looking for. And so you might want to look at the different variations of the surnames. And this might be part of the reason why many people have hit a roadblock, because most people are not thinking about they need to look at convict records when they're looking for their ancestors. But this is another area that people need to consider when looking for the records of their ancestors. And so on here you can see it's a list of the rebel prisoners and their confinement, and then there's information about what role they played in the rebellion, and you know, what their job was. So you've sergeant up there, some were privates, and so you can see that. And then there's information about the plea. And so for some individuals, they were saying that they were forced to participate. Some individuals, it's noted that they actually surrendered, so they did not have to be pursued. And so you can find a lot of information in there. Now, there is some data that is not available, and it's maintained only in England. So if you get an opportunity to head over to England, you can perhaps see some of the records firsthand. And so the question is, who are your people? And to answer that question, you're going to have to ask even more questions. And so there's more information about the Jacobites and what happened when people were rebels. And the Jacobites, there were several Jacobite rebellions that involved the Stuart family. So all things Stuart, as one commenter has noted, all things Stuart. And so for the Stuart dynasty, basically, there were a number of rebellions. And so there were a number of times when people were involved in these rebellions related to the Stuarts and the succession battles for that crown. And so again, Barbados was a place that people were sent in terms of banishment. Not only were Europeans sent to Barbados, but a number of American Indians were sent to Barbados. And it was that same phrase, you know, they said that they were able to control some of the Indians by making them afraid of being Barbadosed. And so Barbados apparently has a very interesting history. And so one of the things that happened was that there were a large number of prisoners that were shipped, and they were indentured. And there's even an indication of some of the names that many of them had, like the McDonalds and the Mackenzies and the Grants. And so you can, you know, start to look at, you know, some of the records, you know, through a different lens. And here you can see basically the declaration of war that was made regarding the monarchy, regarding the crown. And so a number of individuals were also enslaved or executed related to this particular rebellion. And you can see that it says that they do hereby declare that they have come into the kingdom with written orders to make war against the King of England. And at that time, the King of England was from the Hanover family, the Hanover dynasty. And you can see Hafon's little face peeking out down below. Because there was a moment in time when there was the issue about the succession for that crown, and Europe was exceedingly involved in that issue. And so, as mentioned before, there appears to be some relationship between the succession battle that took place in Africa and some of the succession battles that were taking place in Europe. And what you see here is a communication regarding the rationale for the rebellion and what was really at stake in the rebellion. And so this was a battle for the crown. It was a very serious battle for the crown. And the issue was basically who had the right to occupy that position. who was supposed to be in that position. Now, one of the things to note is that King James and his descendants believed in the divine right of kings. And so they were making a push for that position based upon their belief in that divine right. And they believed that they were the legitimate heirs to that throne. And so essentially, to make this make sense, the individuals who were convicted of treason were throughout time, for various reasons, they were involved in rebellions related to the crown and related to supporting whoever it is they believed was the person who was supposed to be occupying the throne. And for those who are not clear, the Stuart monarchy is related to King James and his descendants. And so these battles that have been going on, or that had been going on, were related to his descendants, usually his sons, or the boys, the male heirs, but sometimes it involved the females also. And in one of the rebellions, you can see some of the writing. The sentiment was basically, our enemies have represented us as men of low birth. And the indication was that they were now in arms, as seeing themselves, for the most part, as the ancient family of the land. It's also important to note that many of these battles had something to do with religion. And so you also will learn something perhaps about your family members when you, if you find them among any of these records, because the rebels tended to rebel based upon their religious affiliations. And it's also important to point out that there was a particular relationship in terms of the slave trading with England, France, and Ouida. As you recall, Ouida also goes by the name of Zuida with the X, and also Juida and Judah in Africa. And so there is some dynamic going on when you look at the slave records and you look at the ship records. You will see that there is some unusual relationship going on there between Europe and Ouida. And of course, as mentioned before, they were heavily involved in that battle for succession. It's also important to note that many individuals also attribute a religious position to King James, and they don't just see him as King James, but they also, for some people, see him as a representative of Jacob. Yes, the patriarch Jacob. And some people, based upon their religious beliefs, they believe that the different kingdoms were related to Jacob in one way, shape, form, or fashion. And so religion also may be playing a part in why people have not been able to readily see all sorts of options in terms of understanding the slave trade and understanding who was involved in the slave trade and how people became enslaved. It's been a long time coming. Now, I know for many men who are brown, there has been the insinuation that when it is discovered that they have the R1b haplogroup, that this is a result of abuse of a female ancestor by a European male. And the assumption is that the European male that abused the female ancestor was a quote-unquote white male. And so hopefully this will open up your eyes to some other possible explanations for why so many men who are classified as African American have DNA, Y haplogroup DNA, that is closely related to those of Irish and Scottish descent. It is perhaps because those are your relatives in ways that you might not have considered in times past. Everything is not always as black and white as people may want it to be. Sometimes things really are shades of gray. Remember, knowledge is power. Take care and see you soon.
I was born by the river in a little tent, but oh, just like the river I've been running ever since. It's been a long time coming, but I know